Well, I just think it's extraordinary, as you said, that this has happened on Australian soil when we have an open and free Australian press in a democratic nation. Do you think that, in fact, the Prime Minister needs to raise this with the Chinese Premier?
So, Danica, I don't want to be unbalanced about this. It's not a huge incident, but Albanese has made it a bigger incident than it needs be because of his apparent extreme timidity about saying, but he's so scared to say anything that might annoy the Chinese and derail this visit. He doesn't need to raise this matter with the Premier. He simply needed to say at the press conference, this is a small incident but completely unacceptable. We utterly stand with Chang Lei. She's an Australian citizen, an Australian journalist, and this behaviour by the Chinese officials was unacceptable. Then if the Chinese decide to overreact to that, that's up to them. But he is so scared, the Albanese government is so scared that if they say one word out of the Chinese approved script, they'll get a bad reaction. So the analogous case was after he met with Xi Jinping in San Francisco, 4 or 5 days after the Chinese Navy had fired sonars at Australian naval divers and caused them physical injury. He still won't tell us, the Prime Minister, whether he raised that with Xi Jinping, which probably means he didn't raise it because there'd be no reason not to tell us. But then he had a press conference but made sure that Canberra didn't release the information about this incident until after the press conference was over. Well, this kind of sort of pathetic timidity, it's unbecoming. I mean, Albo, I've got a lot of admiration. I think he's a good bloke, but this is unbecoming. This looks like a Prime Minister who's got stage fright, who can't cope with the Chinese just in a normal way. Doesn't have to be, doesn't have to, I think Dutton and Morrison did overdo the rhetoric, doesn't have to go down that road. But if he can't call out egregious Chinese misbehaviour, even on our own soil, well, that's an overreaction. It's too defensive. It's too timid.
But I just think that there needs to be more of a stand up for Australian values by this government. I mean, there's been so many incidents, as I went to earlier in my editorial. But look, I just want to ask you about climate, because you've written in The Australian today that the oil, gas and coal boom have shattered this decarbonisation myth. Now, we hear it all the time, Greg, that the climate wars, that they have been sparked, particularly ahead of the next election. But you don't actually think that is the case. Why?
Well, climate is contentious all over the world, except most of the world is not nearly as obsessed about it as we are. I mean, it's hardly figuring in the American debate. And in the European elections recently, there was a massive drop in the Greens vote, and the European Union has abandoned many elements of its Green New Deal. But simply as a matter of fact, I wouldn't want any of your viewers to take my word for it. And of course, ABC viewers will never hear anything like this. But oil, gas and coal, yes, coal, are at record high usage in the history of the human race today. Not only that, global greenhouse gas emissions are rising and are at a record high. So it's simply a matter of fact that the world is not decarbonising. Now, very advanced nations like North America, Europe and us are reducing our emissions a bit, but the big growth in emissions comes in China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and so on. Now, I don't think, therefore, we abandon the idea that we reduce our emissions, but it's crazy to send the economy bankrupt and massively increase our energy prices in order to reach an insane target like a 42% reduction by 2030. The world will not notice whether we have a 42% reduction or a zero reduction. But if we ended up with a 20% reduction, that would be perfectly fine. It's not going to have the slightest effect on the physical climate. And as a simple matter of fact, the rest of the world is not decarbonising. The world is increasing its greenhouse gas emissions. That may be a terrible thing, but we ought to be aware of that reality when we shape our own policy.
Yeah, it's certainly a fair point. Greg Sheridan, we have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this evening.